As I remember in our history books tell, we were the first troops of the American Third Army to cross into Germany. We didn't have such a thing as sunshine. We had a 160-acre farm in the Great Depression of 1929 when the stock market crashed and the Depression came on. We lost our farm. Lots of times you didn't know where your next meal was coming from. We lost more men in 5 minutes than we did throughout the whole thing. I was glad to be in the Army.
Born on September 29, 1923 in Weaver, Iowa, Robert Bennett Persinger was the oldest of 5 children. In 1939, his father passed away, and Robert and his family moved with his uncle to Marengo, where he worked for Miguel Metal Products. Soon thereafter, Pearl Harbor occurred, and Persinger was drafted into the Army.
And then Pearl Harbor come around, and the next thing you know, I was 1A. I was drafted, and I could have gotten a deferment when I went to Woodstock, Illinois, to be drafted and they told me then I should definitely take a deferment because you're the head of the family. And I had 2 sisters besides, and my mother. I was put into a 3rd Armored Cavalry Unit, organized in Camp Gordon, Georgia. We went on to maneuvers in Tennessee, and after maneuvers we went back to our base at Camp Gordon, Georgia, and then went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And we were preparing to get ready for overseas, but we had to have one final month of firing all of our guns. I was in the tank company, and I became a tank commander.
After 30 days of on-the-range training, Persinger and his company boarded a British liner in New York on their way to Liverpool, England. 13 days later, they arrived in Liverpool, 1 month after D-Day.
We got to Liverpool, was put on a train, and we went to a staging area near Southampton. Now, this is a big port where all Americans left from there to go to the Normandy beaches. And we left and arrived at Utah Beach we went over on a landing ship tank.
By late August, early September, Persinger and his company joined the 3rd Army Unit at the Battle of St. Lo. At this point, the Germans were retreating back behind enemy lines, allowing Persinger's unit to travel across Germany towards Luxembourg.
I remember that day because that was a day that we entered into the little country of Luxembourg, way behind the enemy lines, and they were so surprised. The civilians there in Luxembourg couldn't believe, here we are, some Americans here already. So we did have to leave and go back to help to take the city of Metz, which was 2.5-month battle to get that.
The Battle of Metz, France was over by the 1st of November. From there, Persinger's unit traveled along the Siegfried and the Maginot Line in order to cross the Moselle River into Germany.
We were in Germany on the 17th of November. As I remember in our history books tell, we were the first troops of the American Third Army to cross into Germany.
On December 16th, Persinger's unit was behind the Siegfried Line in the small town of Tejan, Germany. The Battle of the Bulge occurred on this same day, and the American troops were shelled very heavily by German forces. Once the Germans were driven back, Persinger and his unit moved across the Rhine River toward the city of Trier, Germany.
The big city of Trier, Germany, is there to be taken. So we got involved in that. The Air Force had told us the night before that they had spotted no Germans of any kind in the woods ahead of us. Well, that was wrong. That was one of the worst battles that we had. We run into a lot of firefights doing reconnaissance, but this was the first time we ever ran head-on into some area where we were told it was clear. And that, of course, we retreated back down in our safe position. And eventually, we got across the Rhine River.
After crossing the Rhine River without any further combatant fire, Persinger and the Third Army entered into the city of Mainz, Germany. They continued completing reconnaissance work while making their way north and west towards Berlin. Midway there, the army turned southwest towards Austria and Czechoslovakia.
Now we're in Austria, and the Germans begin now. It's latter part of April of 45, the last week of April, and the Germans, we were trying to meet the Russians at the Elbe River, and the Germans were surrendering to us in droves because they didn't want us to drive them into the Russian front.
On the 5th of May 1945, Persinger and the Third Army engaged themselves in their last major battle of World War II against 1,200 Hungarians in Völkerbruck, Austria. One tank was knocked out and 2 of the men were killed. That same afternoon, they made their way 15 miles down the road towards the Alps Mountains to the small town of Gemünden, then another 15 miles south towards the town of Ebensee.
We kept going right in the center of town. Our lieutenant went in as we stopped and told. We were sitting there, the reconnaissance platoon were driving around with their jeeps. They had 5 jeeps. They were driving around in this little town, and they run into some people saying, look, there is a concentration camp up in there in the hills.
Being a platoon sergeant, Persinger and his tank crew were ordered to go to the gates of the concentration camp to verify a lack of resistance.
As we got up to near a couple hundred yards from up there, you could start smelling this terrible, the smell and the stench of death. And those people were standing in that terrible place. I'm sure you've all seen maybe cow yards or, yes, cow yards where they feed animals, where they stand in mud. Well, this is what those people were doing. And amongst that, dead bodies here and there. A horrible place. They looked almost like ghosts because behind them was these tall pine trees. This was high in the mountains, and there wasn't much open ground. There was a big area called the Roll Call Square. Now the electricity had been turned off. Nobody was there. There was only outside of the gates was some older people my age standing there with the rifles and some with the bazookas that would go through a tank. A bazooka would, at short range, would disable a tank. So these people had been sent there. Now, I should tell you that the Volkssturm was called the civilian army. Hitler gave nearly all of these people in these small villages and towns and cities a rifle or bazooka.
Unconcerned by the Volkssturm, Persinger and his tank crew entered the concentration camp in order to view the surroundings in hope of releasing the prisoners.
They were standing there. We thought nothing of it because we were peering down at these people and actually couldn't believe what we were seeing. We paid no attention to those guys because they didn't do nothing. They weren't trying to resist or fight us or anything. Well, pandemonium broke out. There's so much cheering and stuff. When they saw that beautiful white star on our front slope plate of the tank, of both tanks, they knew that the Americans or somebody was there to free them, that they weren't German SS or any German troops. They were something different. And I just can't tell you how they started singing, just praising us, and yet they wanted us to come in and with somebody open the gates. As they opened the gates, our tank pulled in, and there was a fixture up above with a light on it. I reached down by this German Volkssturm, and I just simply took the rifle out of his hands, and it has a sling on the rifle. I hung it on I broke it over the muzzle of our tank. I'd done that and hung it by the strap over that light fixture. At that time, there was constant roar for seemed like maybe 2 or 3 minutes, or 5 minutes, but more. In other words, if they could have made more noise, they did. And we drove in and stopped our tanks and did not dismount and get off our tanks. We just sat and looked at them. And we talked by the radio to all of we could all talk because our radios had throat pieces to talk. You didn't have to have a mic, you could have it. And so we were talking, and they wanted us to get down off of the tank. One man, well, then at that time, I should say, I could get higher in my turret by raising the seat, and it sprung up. And a man saw me then light a cigarette, and in all this noise, now he was standing right here by the edge of our tank, and I could hear that, because the rest, they were speaking in Polish and Jewish and every language there was, it seemed to me like, and I couldn't understand none of it, because I never did. I could speak a few German words and a few French words just because we went through that country, and I picked up some. But when he said that, I said, come on up and I'll give you one. So as he was coming up, I took another cigarette and lit it off of mine. He got up on the top of our turret and was leaning on the area of the turret, and I gave him the cigarette. He took one large puff and he almost just buckled. Now this man, he looked to be in a little better health than most of them. And most of them weighed 60 to 70 to 75 pounds. That's all they weighed. They were skin and bones. Just that's all they were. But his name was Max Garcia.
While liberating Ebensee, Persinger made a special connection with one of the prisoners. Max Garcia took Persinger and his tank crew around the camp and showed them the damage that had been caused.
So Max told me about this whole thing and how horrible it was in good, perfect English. And I called my lieutenant on the radio and told him I had a man that could speak English, and it was the only one that I'd heard so far. He said, just hang on to him, we'll be there, we want him. And so he stayed with us right there on the tour until he come up with the Jeep and officers. My lieutenant come up, and they got him. But anyway, prior to them coming up and picking him up, he insisted that we should get off of the tanks and go around the camp. He wanted to show us. Now, the people that were so thin and like just skin and bones were filthy, just absolutely filthy. They were dressed in that striped uniform, and some just had the pants on, and some just had the top on, and some didn't have nothing on, stripped naked, nothing. Now, there was no women in this place, just all men. You just couldn't believe what you were looking at. And the sores, the open sores in their hair, caused from lice. So we got down off of the tanks, and immediately we were hugged like you wouldn't believe. And it was one of the worst things that I'd ever been taken into, and we wondered why we ever got off of those tanks. I have learned to live with it, and I thought of it so many, many, many times. When anybody mentions the service, things that men go through, I keep thinking how terrible, terrible, terrible it was for those people to just get killed without anything to fight back with. Nothing. They had nothing, and they were just starved to death.
2 days after the Third Army liberated Ebensee, the war in Europe ended. Although they had to endure all the hardships that go along with any war, Persinger believes that he and the Third Army were incredibly lucky because of their reconnaissance work.
So we did get home, and then the most wonderful thing, as far as I'm concerned, the atomic bomb dropped, and then the other one, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then and the war ended. It was the most. I was so thrilled to think that it was all over, and I was one of the lucky ones. Maybe it was because I've often thought, well, I could think of my mother back home, my other two brothers in the service, and I knew, and they were in combat areas, both of them in the Navy, and I knew she was worried to death. But to thinking that I was going to soon go home.
Persinger spent over 2 years serving his country overseas in a war that would define a generation.
This was an experience that I can never forget. Those memories of that camp are glued in my mind. I just cannot forget that.
Robert Persinger earned the awards Combat Medal with 4 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart, and Good Conduct, and he earned the titles of Experienced Small Machine Gunner and Experienced Large Machine Gunner.
Throughout the entire interview, he kept me completely enthralled with every memory he shared with us. Every photograph he showed us only brought his experiences to life, and we were lucky enough to get a small glimpse into his time in the war. Mr. Persinger's interview is something I am honored to have been a part of and will always remember.
The stories he told us touched me and made me appreciate what I have today. His tank commanding experience in the war shows his ambition and motivation in the U.S. Army. When he told us the story of the Ebensee concentration camp, I could hear the sadness and the sympathy in his voice for those that he liberated. It is the stories like Mr. Persinger's that allows me to truly understand what World War II was like.
Mr. Persinger was a true influence. It's not every day when you get to sit down with a World War II veteran and hear about the war, let alone a veteran who liberated a concentration camp. Mr. Persinger was very willing to share with us and very open with all of his experiences. His story he shared was very heartwarming and a great learning experience. Mr. Persinger's unit was responsible for liberating a concentration camp in Ebensee, Austria. His detailed account of the camp and the horrors he saw, but also about the hope and the happiness the prisoners had when his platoon arrived, was inspiring.
The best part overall would have been the story he told of his platoon unit liberating this concentration camp in Ebensee, which was extremely moving on the whole group's behalf. With his time serving overseas in the European theater, it was amazing to hear that the things learned in school were actually done by the man sitting in front of us.
And I think it can speak for everyone in my group. We were unprepared for the depth in which he told his experiences. Mr. Persinger remembers specific dates, smells, faces of people he only saw once or twice. His vast memory was extensive, and with the wide range of encounters he took part in, it was even more impressive that he told us with so much detail. He is an unbelievable man who will live in my memory forever when I think of an American veteran.